aren't even truly her granddaughter," my father hissed, his expression twisted with fury. "The family wealth belongs solely to those with our bloodline." I remained motionless in Grandmother Eleanor's library, the massive wooden bookshelves lined with leather volumes encircling us like quiet observers of his harsh words. Grandmother had been laid to rest merely 3 days prior, yet the family was already splitting apart over her testament. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice nearly drowned by my racing heartbeat. "Stop pretending ignorance, Jennifer. Your mother's hidden truth has finally come to light." He walked across the Persian carpet, stopping to stare coldly at Grandmother's formal painting displayed over the mantelpiece. "Eleanor was fixated on ancestry. After the attorney verifies you possess no Blackwell heritage, you'll receive absolutely nothing." I met his gaze directly, struggling to maintain a calm voice. "Will you honor your promise that solely blood family members merit Grandmother's legacy?" "Certainly," he proclaimed, raising his head with that same arrogant angle I'd witnessed repeatedly during my youth. "I'll ensure the family wealth remains with genuine Blackwells, not pretenders. I am Jennifer Blackwell. I have lived 27 years and until moments ago, I considered Douglas Blackwell to be my birth father. Now positioned in my grandmother's colonial estate in Philadelphia suburbs, I was seemingly learning something entirely different. My desire was straightforward: the equitable treatment Grandmother Eleanor had planned in her testament. She had explicitly named me her sole granddaughter when we last discussed her property arrangements. Blocking my path was the individual who had consistently regarded me with barely concealed disdain. The individual whose acceptance I had pursued for decades without success. "You may come to next week's will ceremony if necessary," he went on dismissively, "but anticipate nothing. I've already discussed with Harrison about contesting any clauses that benefit you." Harrison Mills served as my father's old companion and our family's legal counsel. The reference to their seeming conspiracy chilled me. "I will attend," I responded softly. "Grandmother expected my presence there." "Pure emotion," he mocked. "Eleanor always favored you too much. Thankfully, legal matters focus on evidence, not sentiment." When he departed the room, I collapsed into Grandmother's office chair, touching the smooth walnut desk where she had composed numerous letters, examined business papers, and recently completed her final will. My cellular device chimed with a message from my mother. "We must discuss your father this evening, privately." I gazed at the text, anxiety creeping through me. If Douglas wasn't my birth father, then who could be? How had this truth stayed buried for 27 years? More crucially, why was it emerging now, just days following Grandmother's passing and before her fortune's division? Regardless of what truth lay ahead, one fact was crystallizing in my thoughts. The father whose approval I'd spent my existence seeking had been nursing resentment far more profound than I'd ever suspected. Being raised as a Blackwell involved managing a realm of wealth and significant duties. The Blackwell assets, established through pharmaceutical licensing and clever investments, had supported 3 family generations in substantial comfort. My father, Douglas, was the older of 2 boys, which naturally placed him as the expected recipient of most Blackwell properties. His younger sibling, James, had become the family nonconformist, intelligent yet restless, refusing to accept our grandfather's strict family legacy vision. He'd departed Philadelphia for medical research in Seattle, only returning occasionally for significant family gatherings. My recollections of Uncle James were few but pleasant. His infectious laughter, considerate presence, and how he'd address me as if my thoughts had value. Conversely, my connection with my father had remained tense. Douglas Blackwell measured value through accomplishments and social position. My brothers, Thomas and William, had met his expectations perfectly. Thomas joining the family enterprise, William succeeding in legal studies. However, I had let him down repeatedly. "She doesn't possess the Blackwell determination," he'd commented to my mother when he assumed I couldn't overhear. "Too gentle, too unfocused." Despite earning academic honors and building a successful career in historical conservation, None of my achievements appeared to satisfy his requirements. I'd blamed this constant disappointment on gender bias or perhaps impossible standards, never considering there might be a more basic explanation for his coldness. Grandmother Eleanor had provided my refuge. Unlike my father, she appreciated my historical and artistic interests, supporting me to follow a direction that respected my desires rather than family customs. Throughout my college years, I'd visit her property every Sunday for afternoon tea. Hearing her tales of family heritage and her own quiet rebellions against the limitations imposed on women of her era. "Keep in mind, Jennifer," she frequently advised me, "a Blackwell creates their own destiny." Her peaceful death at 86 had left a void I was still learning to navigate. Understanding that I'd lost my strongest family supporter made her absence even more devastating. During the days after her funeral, I'd observed subtle shifts in my father's conduct. Increased examination when I spoke with other relatives, whispered discussions with Harrison Mills that suddenly ceased when I appeared. I dismissed these observations as grief expressing itself differently. Now they assumed a more threatening meaning. The final time I'd seen grandmother alive, she'd grasped my hand with unexpected force and murmured, "Follow your intuition, Jennifer. Everything isn't what it seems." Then, I'd attributed her mysterious words to medication or exhaustion. Now, I questioned if she'd been attempting to prepare me for the upheaval about to engulf our family. Leaving grandmother's library to meet my mother, I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being pulled into a family conflict decades old, with origins deeper than I could currently understand. My mother awaited me at her preferred restaurant, hidden in a peaceful city corner where Blackwells became just regular individuals. She appeared diminished somehow, her typically flawless appearance somewhat unkempt, eyes darkened by sleepless evenings. "I never intended for you to discover this way," she started immediately, her fingers anxiously rotating her wedding ring. "Your father, Douglas, shouldn't have informed you so harshly. It was heartless and self-interested." "Then it's accurate?" I questioned, my voice nearly inaudible. "He isn't my birth father," she confirmed with a nod, tears forming in her eyes. "The situation is complex, Jennifer, more intricate than Douglas portrays." During the following hour, my mother revealed a narrative that destroyed everything I believed about my family. She and James, my uncle, had shared a romance before meeting Douglas. They'd been youthful, passionate, and planning their future when James received a prestigious research opportunity in Seattle. "We decided he should accept," she clarified. "It was an amazing chance. We believed we could handle the separation, but the distance had damaged their relationship, and during a particularly challenging time, she'd grown close to Douglas, who had always admired her from a distance. A vulnerable moment led to a brief romance, which she ended upon realizing her heart remained with James. When I learned I was expecting, I was convinced it was James's child. The timing matched perfectly with his last visit home." Her voice shook. "But Douglas claimed the child was his, and James had already become engaged to someone else by then. I didn't want to disturb his new life. Douglas had proposed immediately, framing their marriage as the honorable answer. Only later did my mother understand that his interest had never been purely about her. The Blackwell fortune included strict inheritance rules that favored male heirs with legitimate offspring. He required a wife and children to maintain his status, she said with bitterness. And I needed security for my baby. It appeared the best choice then. Years went by and the secret remained. James eventually returned to Philadelphia with his spouse, but they had no children. When his marriage dissolved, he devoted himself to medical research, becoming increasingly removed from family matters. Did James ever learn the truth? Yes. No, my mother whispered. I couldn't bear disrupting his life again. As years passed, it seemed crueler to expose the truth. The disclosure left me stunned. Every childhood memory now needed re-examination. My father's coldness, Uncle James's warmth during his infrequent visits, Grandmother Eleanor's special attention toward me. Why is Douglas exposing this now? Finally asked. My mother's expression hardened. Your grandmother's will. He's always been fixated on the Blackwell fortune, and now he's concerned Eleanor might have left you a substantial portion. He needs to undermine your claim. But if I'm not a blood Blackwell— That's exactly it, she interrupted. You are a Blackwell by blood, just not Douglas's child. You're James's daughter, which makes you Eleanor's granddaughter by blood anyway. The irony was almost too flawless. My father's effort to exclude me from the inheritance by denying our biological relationship might actually reinforce my claim through a different family branch. What should I do now? I asked, feeling lost in this new reality. My mother reached across the table to hold my hands. That depends on your desires, Jennifer. Justice, recognition, or simply your rightful share of what Eleanor intended for you. I didn't have a response yet. The betrayal was too recent, the consequences too enormous to process in one discussion. But leaving the restaurant, one certainty formed in my mind. I would not permit Douglas Blackwell to revise my history for his financial benefit. The challenge was proving my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would strengthen or weaken my position in the intricate network of Blackwell inheritance regulations. The following morning, I traveled to Uncle James's residence, heart pounding against my chest. I had called beforehand, keeping my purpose unclear. Family issues to discuss before the will reading. Now sitting in his simple living room surrounded by scientific publications and travel souvenirs, I struggled to find words to disrupt his world alongside mine. You appear troubled, Jennifer, he noticed, placing 2 teacups on the coffee table. At 58, James Blackwell stayed attractive with the same dark eyes I observed in my reflection each morning. Is Douglas creating difficulties regarding Eleanor's estate? It's more complex than that, I started, then hesitated. How does one ask a man if he might be your biological father? Uncle James, did you and my mother ever— Were you two ever involved before she married father? The cup stopped midway to his lips, his expression changing from surprise to careful wariness. Why would you inquire about ancient history now? Because Douglas has told me that he's not my biological father, and he's using that assertion to contest my position in grandmother's will. James placed his cup down with careful control. That sounds like Douglas, calculating even in his cruelty. He examined my face with fresh intensity. What has your mother shared with you? I repeated my mother's disclosures about their previous relationship, watching his expressions move through nostalgia, pain, and something resembling hope. I never realized, he said finally. Catherine never informed me she was expecting. By the time I learned about the marriage, it was already completed. He leaned forward. Jennifer, are you suggesting you think I might be your father? The timing aligns according to mother, but Douglas is determined to prove I have no Blackwell blood to claim my inheritance. James's expression grew dark. Eleanor's will specifically names you. Douglas can't simply remove you from it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false assumptions, namely that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter. James stood suddenly, pacing the small space. This is ridiculous. Even if you weren't Douglas's biological child, you're still Eleanor's granddaughter if you're my daughter. He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. We need to know with certainty. A DNA test would resolve this question definitively. The clinical straightforwardness of his solution both comforted and frightened me. You'd be willing to take one? Without question, he replied. I've always felt a bond to you that I couldn't quite understand. If you are my daughter, his voice caught, well, let's confirm the facts before we get carried away. We arranged for expedited testing that same day using a private laboratory promising results within 72 hours. Just enough time before the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation settled in my stomach. Regardless of the outcome, my relationship with both men would be permanently changed. While waiting for results, I tried to gather information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, Bernard Walsh, separate from the family lawyer, Harrison Mills. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, Bernard explained when I visited his office. But I can assure you that your grandmother was mentally sound and very clear about her intentions. Did she know? I asked directly about my biological parentage. Bernard's carefully neutral expression slipped momentarily. I cannot comment on that, but I will say that Eleanor Blackwell was a remarkably observant woman who very little escaped her attention. His non-answer revealed everything I needed to know. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was James's daughter, not Douglas's. My brief victory disappeared when I received a formal letter that evening. Harrison Mills had petitioned the court to postpone the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding supposed beneficiaries. Douglas was moving faster than expected, using his legal connections to gain time while he built his case against me. When I called Bernard to inquire about the delay, his secretary informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. It couldn't be coincidence. Douglas was systematically eliminating my potential supporters and information sources. Without Bernard or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a severe disadvantage. That night my mother called in distress. Douglas knows you met with James. He's enraged. Jennifer, be cautious. When Douglas feels threatened, he becomes dangerous. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With shaking hands, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried within scientific terminology. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. James Blackwell was unquestionably my biological father. I sat back, emotions overwhelming me: vindication, grief for the relationship I never experienced, anger at years of deception. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. Douglas, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called James, who received the news with quiet emotion. I suspected from the moment you asked, he admitted. You have Catherine's smile, but those eyes, they're Blackwell eyes. My mother's eyes. We agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against Douglas, or so I thought. That evening, Harrison Mills requested an urgent meeting at his office. Despite my concerns, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from my father's, Douglas's legal ally. The elegant offices of Mills and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Harrison, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. Jennifer, thank you for coming. I thought we should discuss certain developments before the will reading. You mean the fact that Douglas isn't my biological father, or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading? His smile tightened. Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and James arranged. My blood froze. How could he possibly know about the test? We had been meticulously careful. Douglas was quite upset to learn of this independent investigation, Harrison continued. He asked me to convey a proposal. He slid a document across his desk. It was a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Eleanor Blackwell's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $250,000. This is absurd, I said, pushing it back. Grandmother specifically included me in her will. Yes, under the assumption you were Douglas's daughter. Now that we know otherwise. Now we know I'm James's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Eleanor's granddaughter than if I were Douglas's. I interrupted. Blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Isn't that what Douglas always says? Harrison's expression shifted. There are complexities you're unaware of, Jennifer. Legal nuances regarding the Blackwell Trust that supersede simple biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Douglas is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests. The veiled threat hung between us. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Harrison's confidence despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. James called, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Jennifer, I've just received some disturbing information from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my father decades ago." He paused. "Douglas isn't biologically a Blackwell." "What?" The room seemed to tilt around me. Apparently, my parents adopted Douglas as an infant after my mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Douglas to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Douglas wasn't a blood Blackwell, then by his own logic, does Douglas know? Managed. I don't think so. Our parents took the secret to their graves. But Eleanor might have known. She and my mother were extremely close. That's why Harrison was so confident, I breathed. There must be something in the will or trust document specifying blood relations. Exactly. I've been reviewing copies of the original Blackwell Trust. There's a specific clause requiring direct bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Douglas would have been protected by his legal adoption, but by making this about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself. The irony was almost too perfect. Douglas's attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Blackwell line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. "What do we do with this information?" he asked. James was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want, Jennifer. What Douglas deserves and what's right for our family might be different things." I considered his words carefully. "I think," I said slowly, "that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own standards. Don't you?" The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, Philadelphia's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside grandmother's mansion where the family had gathered. I arrived early with James, our shared secret a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. Harrison Mills presided from the head of the dining table, leather portfolio open before him, while various Blackwell relatives filled the high-backed chairs. Douglas sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my brothers, who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. "Before we begin," Harrison announced, "I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility." Douglas straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. "It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Eleanor Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Blackwell Family Trust." My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Harrison continued, "As you know, Eleanor's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Blackwell line. Which is precisely why we need to address Jennifer's situation," Douglas interrupted smoothly. "Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter and therefore has no claim to the Blackwell inheritance." A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. James and I exchanged glances. Our carefully rehearsed plan suddenly derailed by Douglas's preemptive strike. "I have DNA evidence," Douglas continued, sliding a folder toward Harrison, "confirming Jennifer is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution." My heart pounded as Harrison reviewed the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Douglas had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing I had never consented to or provided samples for. "May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Douglas's smile was cold. "From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really." "That's illegal," James interjected. "Unauthorized DNA testing. Irrelevant to the inheritance question," Harrison cut in. "The science is sound regardless of collection methods." I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Harrison accepted Douglas's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. "I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question," I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. DNA confirmation that James Blackwell is my biological father. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Douglas's face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. "This changes nothing," Harrison insisted after reviewing our documentation. "The trust specifies Blackwell blood from Eleanor's direct line, which flows through her son, Douglas, to his legitimate heirs. It was the opening we needed." James stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. "I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust," he said. "My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Blackwell, Eleanor's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem." Harrison frowned. "What problem?" "Douglas is not biologically a Blackwell," James stated clearly. "He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Eleanor was aware of." The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. "That's absurd," he finally sputtered. "A desperate lie." "I have the adoption records," James continued implacably. "And DNA confirmation." He produced another folder. "If we're applying a strict bloodline test, as Douglas insists, then I am Eleanor's only biological child, and Jennifer, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild." Harrison looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to Douglas visibly warring with his professional obligations. "This is outrageous," Douglas shouted, rising from his chair. "I won't stand for this slander. You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune," I reminded him quietly. "Are you retracting that position now?" Before Douglas could respond, the library doors opened to reveal a frail but determined Bernard Walsh, grandmother's personal attorney, leaning on a cane. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said, nodding to me. "I believe my presence is required for this reading." Harrison's dismay confirmed our suspicion. Bernard's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering Douglas had orchestrated in his absence. "I would like to review the documents before proceeding," Bernard insisted, his experienced gaze already noting the tension filling the room. As Bernard settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before him, Douglas looked truly afraid for the first time. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Harrison was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Bernard adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the final pages of grandmother's will, his voice steady and authoritative. "Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw attention to a letter Eleanor Blackwell instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding." He opened a sealed envelope, the Blackwell crest embossed on heavy cream paper. The room fell silent as he began to read. "To my family gathered here, if this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Douglas was not born of Blackwell blood, but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known since the moment I first held her that Jennifer is James's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Blackwell Trust established by my father requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Blackwell fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Douglas, you have been my son in every way that matters, but your treatment of Jennifer, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Blackwell name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet." Bernard paused, looking directly at Douglas, whose face had gone ashen. "In accordance with Eleanor's explicit instructions," Bernard continued, "and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Douglas's adoption and Jennifer's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Blackwell bloodline pass to James Blackwell and his biological daughter Jennifer. Eleanor's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here." Douglas lunged for the documents, but Bernard calmly shifted them away. "You promised," Douglas shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." "No," I corrected him quietly. "You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it, and you promised you would." The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Douglas's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. Douglas, undone by his own machinations, stormed from the mansion, shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. Harrison Mills followed, his professional reputation in tatters after Bernard revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly. Thomas, always the more sensitive of the two, spoke first. "I had no idea about any of this," he said quietly. "All those years, the way he treated you. It makes a terrible kind of sense now." William nodded soberly. "For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed." Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by Douglas too, in different ways. Perhaps there was a relationship worth salvaging there, given time. Mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. "I should have told you years ago," she said. "You were protecting me," I finished for her. "I understand that now." The most profound conversation came later that evening when James and I sat in grandmother's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. "What will you do now?" he asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. "Build something new," I answered simply. "We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward." He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. "I'd like that very much." As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt grandmother's presence in the room. Her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, Douglas's downfall came not from my actions, but from his own character revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect and perfectly sufficient. As I looked toward the future, a future that included a father who actually wanted me in his life, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all.